Welcome to this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today, a look at Canada's decision to send turbines being repaired here in Canada back to Germany for Russians' use. Here's an interesting fact. Revenues from oil and gas make up 45% of Russia's budget. Fossil fuels fund his brutal invasion of Ukraine. So we will look at Canada's decision over the next couple of weeks. Next week, General Rick Hillier will be here. He's been working on this issue in terms of what Canada's role is. But first, today, we go to our go-to guy on this issue, Marcus Kolga, historian, filmmaker, expert on Russia, and now a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And he writes on this issue regularly. So, Marcus, just your sense of this. Obviously, Mr. Zelensky wasn't very happy with us, and it was kind of like, oh, you have our back until you don't. But it is it's a larger issue because Russia is not even using the turbine and had, it appears, no intention. So was this just a shot across the bow?
Well, I think that all Canadians and certainly your listeners, require some historical context. Vladimir Putin has been using energy as a weapon for the past pretty much 2 decades. He doesn't see it as a commodity. He sees it as a weapon that he can use to intimidate his enemies, his neighbors and such. And so a number of our Eastern European allies, certainly in the Baltics, have realized this over the past number of years. Lithuania, for example, has moved rather quickly over the past few years to diversify its energy needs and has built a floating LNG terminal to wean itself off Russian gas, and other countries have done the same. Ukraine itself has faced significant intimidation, energy intimidation, blackmail over the past decade from Russia. There was a winter a few years ago where Vladimir Putin turned off all the gas in Ukraine for a few hours, a couple of days. And so, this is... Vladimir Putin, as I mentioned, sees this as a weapon and a way to extract concessions from his allies. Many of our European allies, Germany lead among them, are in a very precarious position because they've spent the past number of years developing a strong addiction to cheap Russian gas. They are overly reliant on that gas. And that puts them, especially right now, into a dangerous position where Vladimir Putin, his war in Ukraine is not going well, and he has resorted to using gas again to extract those concessions from countries like Germany. And so he's turned off the taps, and we over the past 4 weeks or so, Gazprom, the company that does supply the gas through the Nord Stream pipeline that connects Russia to Germany, has turned the gas that runs through that pipeline down to a trickle. And the Russian government and Gazprom have blamed all of this on Canada and a plant outside of Montreal that is used to repair those turbines that are used to compress the gas. And I think the Canadian government was duped into believing that these turbines and our sanctions were responsible for the trickle or the turning off of the gas in that pipeline, and we were duped into returning them. And we've seen now over the past number of days that Vladimir Putin clearly has no intention of increasing the flow of gas to Europe, despite us returning it.
Going to shut it down again. So, okay, we understand the argument on one level, which is they were here being repaired. They don't belong to us, so we can send them back. You kind of take that at face value. But if this was a test about whether or not we are really committed, and by we, I don't just mean Canada, but specifically us, are we really committed to sanctions, or are we committed to sanctions when it's convenient?
Well, I mean, and that's, I think, a very good question. How committed are we to those sanctions? Sanctions only work so long as we sustain them and we enforce them. When we carve out exceptions, whenever we feel the heat or whenever we feel intimidated by the targets of those sanctions, it compromises the entire policy and the effectiveness of them. So this is the big problem here, is that by carving out an exception for Gazprom, feeling that pressure, It opens the door for our allies and perhaps the government itself to make further exceptions. And eventually that becomes normalized and we have a return to businesses as usual. And if that's the case, those sanctions will no longer be effective. And essentially, what we end up doing is we end up enabling Vladimir Putin and his war by compromising our own sanctions policy.
I mean, this is part of the problem in the West in general. We have relatively short attention spans. So, everybody is very concerned, and I think legitimately in terms of the population about what is going on there. But leaders tend to move on. And they have other fish to fry in their, in their on the political agenda.
Yeah.
Are we kind of? What's your sense of that? Where are we in terms of our level of commitment, NATO's level of commitment, America's level of commitment? Is it still strong?
Yeah, I think it's strong at the moment. I think the West is unified, but Vladimir Putin is really banking on that fatigue setting in. He's hoping to draw out this conflict. He knows he's not going to, at least in the short term, he's not going to make any gains. Let's not forget that we are now entering the 6th month of what Vladimir Putin declared would be a 3-day special operation to denazify Ukraine. Things are not going well for him, and they won't be going well in the short term. The number of weapons that are being delivered to Ukraine are increasing every day. These HIMARS artillery systems, this is the high mobility rocket systems that are being sent from the US. They are having a significant impact on Russia's ability to make war in eastern Ukraine. Up to 50 Russian arms depots have been targeted over just the past couple of weeks. And so Vladimir Putin's offensive is grinding to a halt. And so his best outcome is that he, like I said, he draws out this conflict, grinds down the West, and hopes that fatigue sets in. And the real hope is that those cracks in the unity amongst our allies will start to appear. The sort of compromise that we made on those turbines. He's hoping to see more of those, and I think that's his way out right now, and that's what he's looking to do.
I raised the question in part because, we saw the US president go to Saudi Arabia kind of hat in hand saying, we need you to increase production. Canada giving in to a certain extent on this. Germany basically saying, look, we need the gas. And if you don't give us those turbines, maybe we won't be able to help Germany out. There seems to be a lot of politics infiltrating this now rather than a humanitarian response to a dire situation.
Well, look, I think that German politicians are looking to the winter, and I think a lot of other European countries are as well. If the trickle of gas through that pipeline continues, it could be a very cold winter in Europe. And I don't think that European politicians have been forthright with their people to let them know that this is the outcome. I hope that political reality won't affect the level of support for Ukraine, because that again is what Vladimir Putin is hoping for. If Europe and Ukraine can make it through this winter, I think that there's a very good chance that Ukraine will be able to take back much of that territory if we sustain that support throughout the fall and the winter and continue to send in military aid. There's a good chance for Ukraine and the Western world to defeat Vladimir Putin in his invasion right now.
There seems to be a message for us in all of this. I mean, what we saw Germany do is really go fast forward on the transition to green, leaving themselves in this vulnerable position, shutting down the nuclear options, all of those things. We seem to be doing the same thing in the West, kind of doubling down on the transition. We have all sorts of resources that we could send, but we have no mechanism to do it. No pipelines, no LNG terminals, etc. So is there should we not be kind of pivoting at this point and saying, hold on? I mean, this could be a very tough winter for our allies. We do need to support Ukraine. Maybe we need to slow down that process a little bit so we can help our allies in Europe with energy sources.
Look, I think gas is being extremely important. I mean, it was important 5 years ago. It's going to continue to be an important source of energy for us for the coming years, perhaps decades, as we transition to green energy. So, burying our heads in the sand and pretending that it's not going to be is strategically is going to be quite dangerous. And that's something that autocrats like Vladimir Putin will take advantage of. So, I think it's critically important. It was critically important 5 years ago. We should have been building those pipelines to Atlantic Tidewater. There were a number of LNG, liquefied natural gas terminals that were being planned in Quebec and on the east coast of Canada. Most of those, if not all of them, have been abandoned. And had we done that 5 years ago, I think we would have been in a much better position to help our European allies. And certainly we could have generated revenues from the export of that gas. I think it's important that the Prime Minister's office looks at this, reconsiders, and reconsiders it as a matter of national security, because Europe's energy security affects us as well. Yeah. And so, ensuring that we can get gas, whether it's through pipelines down to the United States and exporting through U.S. LNG terminals in the short term, but certainly planning on building LNG terminals in the East Coast. There are also options right now. U.S. companies are building offshore LNG terminals that can be built rather quickly. These are options that we should be looking at. But getting our energy out of Alberta and to our allies should be a top priority for this government.
I mean, so far, all we've heard is no way. If there's going to be any terminals built, it'll have to be private capital, period, full stop. They're not engaging. Well, from our federal government.
Yeah. Even if that's the case, I mean, I think they have to expedite the approvals process for all of those and get that moving quickly. I think that's the first thing that we need to do. And if there's any sort of federal support for them, we can look at that afterwards. But just getting a process going, making sure that private capital, there's an open door to it, and that they feel comfortable in that process. I think that's what we need to be looking at right now.
The other issue, as I sit here in Saskatchewan, is the question of food shortages, grain shortages. The promise that Russia made that they would allow Ukrainian grain to move, and then they bombed the port of Odessa, and of course more civilian targets there. And these warnings about food shortages are not coming from political people. They're coming from scientists and professors who study these issues of food. If we, and we've got a separate issue here of restrictions on fertilizer use coming in and the carbon tax. So is our output going to be enough to compensate for the lack of Ukrainian contribution to the market? Or do you think somehow it will get there?
Well, look, I think we have to assume the worst when it comes to Ukrainian grain getting to market. The Vladimir Putin has been targeting Ukrainian agricultural infrastructure since day one of this war. He's been targeting farmers' fields are strewn with mines and missiles and unexploded munitions. Those Ukrainian farmers really are risking their lives in getting that grain planted, or the seeds planted, and harvesting their crops. Up until a few days ago, and I mean, the grains are still stuck in Ukraine. There are 22 million tons of grain that have been stuck in Ukraine. There's a real threat of that grain spoiling. There's also the problem of the summer crop, the storage of that. So this is a real problem. And as you mentioned, this broker deal that Turkey brokered to get that grain out of Odessa and to African markets, it only took about 16 hours for Russia to bomb Ukrainian grain infrastructure. So I don't think that we can trust. I mean, clearly we can't trust Vladimir Putin or any sort of agreement that he puts his name to. So we have to assume that he will continue to, just as he's weaponizing energy, he's also weaponizing food. And so Canada really does have an opportunity here to, expand its own output to try and make up for some of that. Now, it won't make up for all of the grain. If that grain isn't able to make it to market, we won't be able to make up all of that, but we can certainly help contribute to making up for some of it. And that includes, support, making sure that restrictions are lowered for our own farmers in order to do that.
Yeah, that's really the issue. I mean, we know Canada is not a military power, and we don't have a lot to send because we don't have a lot in our arsenal ourselves. So these are the things we need to focus on, which is where we can solve some of the problems, whether it's energy or whether it's providing food. That's where our focus should be.
No, certainly. And I think on the military side, I mean, we've done, almost as much as we can. I mean, we could be funding more weapons to support Ukraine, but we could also be taking leadership. And if we're talking about those ships that are leaving Odessa, we could be taking leadership to ensure that there are escorts for those ships. And making sure that those shipping lanes are defended, and that Russia can't target those ships when they're leaving the port in Odessa. So there's a lot that we can do in that regard with regards to political leadership within NATO and the UN as well.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have the ships to actually do that, do we?
No, I think we've got a couple of frigates, but half of them, they're being repaired all the time, which brings us to another point: is that Canada really needs to start taking national security a bit more seriously, and updating its procurement process. But that's an issue for another podcast.
That's another issue. I read an interesting piece this week about, and I'm sure you'll have a thought on it, that Kazakhstan, so a larger country than kind of Western Europe, it's got about 18 million people there, that the leader has actually publicly and openly defied Putin on this whole invasion of Ukraine. What are we seeing in those areas there in terms of pushback on Putin? Is he feeling any heat from the stands, as they refer to it?
Yeah, and Central Europe as well, or Central Asia in general, and the Caucasus. I think that a lot of those countries are they're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. They felt the pressure from Russia over the past 22 years that Vladimir Putin has been in power. I think that the war has really opened up some opportunities for those countries. They see that possibly doing business with the EU is probably more reliable. It's probably safer. We've seen the European Union sign several gas deals over the past couple of weeks, with certainly with Armenia and Azerbaijan there. And I think that Central Asia is sort of looking to that and thinking, perhaps, the West is a better partner going forward than Russia. Russia doesn't, on paper, Russia offers some security, but, that paper is only as good as, the paper that itself is written on. And I don't think that they can be relied upon. So I think you're seeing those cracks slowly appearing. And I think this is one of the reasons why we've seen, Vladimir Putin travel to Iran last week to try and, make sure that that relationship is still there, to reinforce that, because Vladimir Putin doesn't have a lot of friends. And now this week we see today, in fact, Sergei Lavrov has made a panicked emergency trip to Africa to try and reassure Russia's allies in Africa that Russia is reliable, because I know that there's been considerable doubt among African leaders when it comes to food security, that Russia is responsible for the food shortages that Africa will be facing. So, I think that Russia is feeling the heat, and I think that a lot of those former allies are looking elsewhere beyond Russia for new partners.
This seems to be foreshadowing a real shift in geopolitics. I hate those kind of buzzwords, but America trying to flex its muscles and saying, we're still the superpower and we're kind of in charge here. And in fairness to them, they really are supplying Ukraine with with much needed arms and training and support. So is Britain on the particularly on the training side. But are we seeing, is this really the test? I mean, we've got the strength of the Russia-China relationship being tested as well. Whether America really does hold its place at the top of the heap. There are a lot of shifts going on in the course of this invasion.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that we need to ensure that the alliance remains united, that we sustain this support for Ukraine. I think the next 6 to 8 months are going to be crucial. If we can sustain that support, if we can help ensure that Ukraine holds the territory that it already has and pushes Russia back beyond its borders, I think that will send a strong message to other countries like Iran, like China, and I think that we'll be in much better shape if we can do that. Now, if we continue, or if the threat of potential concessions, if those cracks do start appearing, I think that countries like China are keeping a very close eye on it. And if we do start granting Putin some of those concessions, I think that sends a green light to China to potentially move aggressively in places like Taiwan and elsewhere. So I think China is keeping a very, very close eye on this. China has not come out, like North Korea or Iran, to explicitly back Russia in this invasion, and has not repeated sort of Russia's justifications for its invasion. So I think it's China is keeping its head down. I think it's the sanctions that have been placed on Putin are quite concerning for China as well. They don't want any part of that. They see the West as a much stronger trading partner, obviously, than Russia. And I think when they look at Russia, all they see really is a gas station. They can get cheap gas and oil. And so, quite frankly, China would be happy for this conflict to continue, because it will eventually suppress the price of that Russian crude oil, which is going to be basically banned and out of Europe by next year. And so China will have a cheap energy source there. So its interest is in sustaining this conflict. But China is keeping a close eye on it. And so, like I said, if we can sustain that support for Ukraine, if Ukraine can come out on top and push Putin back beyond the February 24th borders, I think that the democratic sort of community will be far better off than if Ukraine, if this current status quo is sustained, or if Russia makes any sort of gains in eastern Ukraine or southern Ukraine.
What is your sense of whether or not? I mean, most people that are taking a look at this currently just say these sanctions, as we've been discussing, are actually hurting Europe far more than they're hurting Russia at this point. I mean, if he's getting $1 billion a day for his energy, he doesn't care how long this war goes on, because that's paying the bill. We're sustaining it.
Yeah, look, Russia's economy, quite frankly, has contracted over the past several months, whereas Western economies, we're not doing well. Those economies aren't growing at any sort of big pace, but we're not contracting. So Russia really is feeling the brunt of those sanctions. They are inhibiting Vladimir Putin's ability to make war. The ban on the export of any sort of technological components is really hurting him. At least within the context of the war, he's unable to repair the equipment that he has there. There are reports that parts from household appliances are being used to patch up tanks and missiles, and he's pulling out tanks out of warehouses that have been sitting there since the Cold War, and even some World War II tanks are being used. So in that context, those sanctions are working. A lot of Western companies, most Western companies, in fact, have now pulled out of Russia. And I think that Russians themselves are slowly starting to feel those sanctions and the bite of them. And this is one of the intended consequences is for for Russian oligarchs and for the Russian people to feel a bit of that pressure. So whereas a year ago they could walk around Moscow, go to these high-end shopping, buy their Prada products and go to McDonald's for a burger, they can't do that anymore. And eventually, the lack of those conveniences will, I think the Russian people will eventually start, scratching their heads and wonder, why can't we have the same things as we have in the West, and who's responsible for it? And so, I think that if we sustain those sanctions, they're like medicine. They need to run their course, and we need to stick to them. And I think that eventually they'll have a much, right now they're having an effect on Putin's ability to make war, but I think that eventually they will have an overall effect on the Russian economy, and eventually, hopefully, motivate some sort of a change in leadership in Russia as well.
You're still hearing an awful lot of people saying, "Look, this can go on for a while, and yes, the Ukrainians are being very brave, and isn't that wonderful? And we're going to send them some things." But then you hear these voices saying, "Look, at the end of the day, we're just going to have to hive off some real estate, the Donbass, whatever it is, give that to Russia, strike a deal, and make this all stop." That seems like we didn't stop him in Crimea. We've had 4 or 5 opportunities to stop him. If we give in on this and say, yes, take a chunk and go home, that leaves me feeling very, very nervous.
No, we can't do that. We've as you mentioned, we've seen Vladimir Putin do this over and over again. I mean, it's been going on for 22 years, and it's been escalating gradually since the mid 2000s. And so we've seen him do this, whether it's with direct like the invasion of Ukraine, the invasion of Crimea, the invasion of Georgia. And indirectly with political interference, disinformation when it came to the U.S. election and such. Yeah. And so this is the way that Vladimir Putin operates. There are these cycles of whether it's aggression and certainly efforts to destabilize his neighbors and enemies. And we have to understand that if we give in to Vladimir Putin now, this will only enable him to continue that pattern of aggression. And what we need to do right now is to stop that. I think that Canadians need to remember that just last summer, Vladimir Putin changed the constitution of his country, and that change would allow him to remain in power until at least 2036. And if we were to get up to that point and he were still in power, he'd probably change the constitution again. So if things remain the way that they are now, if Vladimir Putin remains in power, we are going to see, up decades, at least 15 years of this sort of aggression, and we need to be prepared for that. Is that something that we are going to just accept and live with, or are we going to fight now? If we decide to fight now, it means supporting Ukraine as much as possible. Those HIMARS that were sent there, we need to double those numbers. We need to give the Ukrainians a fighting chance. If they can beat Vladimir Putin, if they can hand him a strategic defeat in Ukraine, that could change the equation and may teach Vladimir Putin a lesson not to do this sort of thing again. That's the only way we're going to do. That's the only thing that we can do in order to stop this cycle of aggression.
There are, Marcus, a lot of ifs in your comments there. If they can get through the winter, if we continue to support them, if there are no cracks in NATO and in the allies, if the attention span remains focused on this, if we understand what it means. What's your sense?
Well, I think we're okay right now. I mean, the fact that Canada returned these turbines the other week, I mean, that was a concern. I mean, that was the first small crack. Canada succumbed to Russia's blackmail, its intimidation. Germany participated in that. We need to make sure that we those are the sorts of things we don't bend to that sort of intimidation. Looking around Europe and amongst our allies, there still seems to be strong support for Ukraine. The U.S. is clearly backing Ukraine. It is continuing to send those weapons. The UK is doing the same. And certainly our allies in Central and Eastern Europe are doing that as well. If we can sustain this, as I said, again, it's another if we can sustain this, this is the problem is then we'll be okay. But there's so many unknowns. Whether Europe will be able to sustain that level of support, given if it's a very cold winter and there are gas shortages, it's entirely likely that support will crumble. And then I think we're in for a very rough spring next year. And Ukraine is certainly in for a very rough spring, because I think that Vladimir Putin's objectives, even though, I think initially when this conflict broke out, I think a lot of people believe that his objective was to take and hold Donbass. But when that war broke out, he was gunning for Kiev. It's very clear that he wants to take all of Ukraine. And I think that if he could, he would take the Baltic states and many of the other Central and Eastern European nations, because his objective is to reconstitute the Soviet Union. That's been his stated objective. He hasn't hidden that. And so, again, I think that if we can stop him in Ukraine, I think that we stop that. We pour cold water onto that ambition. But if we start giving into this intimidation, if the support breaks down, I think we enable him to continue on that quest to reconstitute the Soviet Union. And the only way that he's going to do that is through considerable violence. And I think that the carnage that could ensue will be unlike anything that we've seen before.
Just a final question, because I was reading about this again last night. He is still, and I use the word in quotes, repatriating people from Ukraine back into Russia. A lot of them are children. He says this is a humanitarian effort. Numbers like 400,000 people. It may be higher. How is he accomplishing that? And how, there are Russian people or Russian sympathizers in Ukraine, if I can put it that way.
Sure.
Are those the people that are going, or are others really be taking, in some sense, as prisoners of war?
Well, this is one of the more disturbing aspects of this entire invasion. First of all, it's the terror, the war of terror against the Ukrainian people, to terrorize them into submission, the bombing of civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and such. The other is the depopulation of many of those areas. And that means, exactly as you're saying, is the forced relocation, the deportation, if you will, of Ukrainians living in parts of eastern and southern Ukraine. And this has been happening. This is not a new phenomenon. This has been happening pretty much since the start of the war. Russia has agreed in many cases to provide humanitarian corridors out of cities like Mariupol, cities that have been basically turned into rubble by Russian artillery. And they've promised humanitarian corridors to allow the citizens of those countries to leave as refugees. In many, if not most cases, after that agreement has been signed, Russian forces have opened fire on refugees. And in many cases, they've set up, and in fact, most cases, they've set up checkpoints when those refugees try to leave. And in many cases, they've basically taken the Ukrainian documents that those people have, torn them up, and have basically sent them off to staging points in further east in Ukraine or even in Russia. And from those staging points, those men, women, and children, largely, women and children, in fact, because that's who are the refugees, they are taken to distant areas of Russia. They're forced to sign contracts where they basically agree to work for very, very low wages, if any at all. And they are transported off, and therefore those areas are in that way sort of quote unquote depopulated. And it smacks of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, where Stalin and the Soviet forces in the regions they occupied, including Ukraine, the Baltic states, they very much engaged in the same sort of depopulation tactics in order to engage in what is clearly recognized nowadays as a cultural genocide against those people. And so this isn't a new tactic that the Russian forces are engaging in. It is disturbing. It is it's something that we we thought we left behind in the last century, but it's being renewed. And I'm glad that you bring that point up, because I think this is one aspect of the war that Western media has sort of not taken a closer look at, and something that we need to remember is happening.
And then again, it turns the light back on us. I mean, with our bureaucratic systems to bring people in. Yes, Ukrainians are arriving here in Canada, but you just hear the same stories. Well, we can't bring them in. They don't have their passports. They don't have their papers. Well, we know why. They're being confiscated and destroyed. So how do we get around that?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think our entire immigration system needs overhauling. I was helping out with Afghan refugees.
Same issue.
I mean, around the same time this year. It was in August of last year, and exactly the same issue. I mean, those Afghans. I mean, I was trying to help out women and children, vulnerable women and children, who simply they didn't have passports, and so to get them out was very difficult. Luckily, we had some European allies who had far more streamlined immigration policies and who were able to help. But that backlog continues to this day with regards to Canada, and it being a point of arrival for those refugees, and the situation continues for Ukrainian refugees. So I think we when we look in the mirror, we see ourselves as this great humanitarian hero. But our hands are tied because of our own policies and our own regulations, and that creates this massive backlog. And so we're not helping as many people as we could. And I think that entire system needs to be overhauled quickly if we want to continue playing that humanitarian role in these sort of conflict zones around the world.
Yeah, I think Afghanistan and Ukraine have really shone a light on that. As we talk about government doing what government should do, which is deliver services. We're looking at the airports, we're looking at the passport offices, and we're looking at our inability to bring men and women who fought alongside our soldiers or served our soldiers in Afghanistan, and now the Ukrainians, who have a very strong base in this country. We have a large Ukrainian population and very open and welcoming arms, and we can't get from point A to point B.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's a really good point. I mean, I work closely with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress here in Canada, and the infrastructure that community has put together to ensure that the transition for these arriving refugees, that it's smooth, that they feel comfortable, that there are homes for them. I mean, it's just incredible the heavy lifting that community has done. They're relying on support from the federal government to make sure that those refugees can get here. But once they get here, I mean, that community has done so much work to cover the costs of these refugees, and to, like I said, to make sure that they feel comfortable. So
those are all citizen dollars that are doing that job.
That's right. I mean, these are volunteers. These are volunteer donations and such that are driving all of that, and it truly is incredible. I mean, I was asked by the Globe and Mail to write an article about the unsung heroes of this war. I focused on the farmers, because I truly believe that they are the unsung heroes. But the other group is really the Ukrainian community in Canada. I think they are unsung heroes in this entire conflict. All of the work that they've been doing, all the support that they've been giving their countrymen in Ukraine is incredible. And I think the support of the Western world that we're seeing today, a large part of that is due to their advocacy. They've done an amazing job, and I think that the Canadians should be proud of the advocacy work that they've been doing.
And we're losing some Canadians on the battlefield there too, as we heard this week. So this week. Marcus, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on this, and always giving us a little perspective on the things we have to think about as we watch this situation unfold. Marcus Kolga, historian, journalist, works at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, but I'm sure you're reading his words in all sorts of publications across the country, and here as often as we can, because you're really very helpful in terms of perspective. So
Thank you so
that
much.
is, yeah, thanks a lot, Marcus. So that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. And as I said earlier, next week we'll be back with Rick Hillier with his perspective on it, because he's been doing a lot of the things you've been trying to do as well, Marcus, is figure out ways to get people here and help them. So see you very soon for another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen.